The summer of 1867 hung thick and still over the farmland just south of Sedalia, Missouri. The land was worn, stitched together by fences that leaned under the weight of too many seasons, and people who had lost too much too fast. But none of that explained the boy Timothy Caldwell. 8 years old, quiet, polite, and hiding something that made even grown men feel cold when he looked their way. Dr. Samuel Harding was the only physician for miles. A man whose hands had stitched wounds from Civil War battlefields, and whose mind had been sharpened by years of suffering he hadn't only witnessed, he'd cataloged. When he met Timothy, the child didn't strike him as cruel. In fact, he seemed perfect, too perfect. Respectful, well-mannered, composed, almost like he was playing a role written for a child, not living one. That meeting took place in June of 1866. Timothy had accompanied his uncle, Thomas Caldwell, into town for supplies. Harding watched the boy closely, his posture, his movements, the way he made eye contact. The child answered questions clearly, with an adult's confidence. But what unnerved the doctor most was the stillness behind those pale blue eyes. Not shyness, not trauma, something else, something observing. Harding would later write, there was nothing visibly wrong with the child. And yet, in his presence, I felt myself studied, as though I were the one under examination. Timothy had come to live with Thomas Caldwell and his wife Sarah just months earlier. After the Civil War, the Caldwell farm had been left in tatters. Thomas's father had died at Wilson's Creek. His mother, Martha, had succumbed to tuberculosis in the winter of 1865. By the time Thomas received news that his brother William had died in a Confederate prison camp, leaving behind a widow and child, he saw no choice but to take the boy in. Timothy arrived in the spring of 1866. He came with nothing but a small cloth satchel and an eerie calm that seemed to unsettle even the chickens. His blonde hair stayed cropped short. Sarah insisted it helped with lice, and his skin, pale and soft, reddened quickly under the Missouri sun. He rarely spoke of his life before, only mentioning that his mother had coughed blood and his father had worn a uniform. When asked about his past, he answered with fragmented sentences and polite indifference to neighbors. Timothy seemed like a godsend. He helped around the farm without complaint, worked harder than any boy his age, and always used yes, sir, and yes, ma'am. But beneath the surface, something was off. Mrs. Elalina Patterson, who lived just beyond the Caldwell property line, noticed strange things. She'd often see the boy in the fields, laboring from dawn until dusk, never pausing to rest, never laughing, never even looking tired. It was like watching a little machine, she told her husband one night. A boy that never plays. Ain't natural. Then the chickens started acting strange. Whenever Timothy was near the fence line, her hens would cluster together in a nervous huddle, ruffling their feathers, squawking in panic. They refused to go near him. Her husband blamed foxes or shadows. But Elalina trusted animals more than explanations. She believed they saw something in Timothy that people chose to ignore. The first death came in August 1866. Mary Fletcher, 5 years old, was the blacksmith's daughter. Everyone in town knew her laugh. Everyone loved her. She wandered often, like children do, and on one sweltering afternoon she didn't return. That evening, Timothy showed up at the Fletcher house, soaked with sweat and wearing a look of strained panic. Mrs. Fletcher, he said softly, I found Mary by the creek. She's not breathing. Her body was discovered face down in Willow Creek, just beyond the Caldwell property. The water was barely knee-deep. Dr. Harding, summoned at once, found the child lifeless and cold. A drowning, he ruled. Tragic, yes, but not uncommon. Rural children played unsupervised near creeks all the time. What troubled him was Timothy's account, The boy described everything, the exact spot Mary was found, how her dress had snagged on a submerged branch, even the color of the water around her mouth. When asked how he found her, he said he was searching for a missing calf. Thomas Caldwell confirmed one had gone missing that morning, and that he'd told Timothy to look near. The creek got still. Something didn't sit right. The boy's memory was too precise. The grief in his voice sounded measured. At the funeral, he sat quietly, head bowed, expression unreadable. When Mary's mother collapsed during the service, overcome with sobs, Timothy's posture didn't change. From across the church, Ella Lanina Patterson watched him carefully. She saw no tears, just eyes, those pale, piercing eyes tracking every motion in the room, like a fox studying the henhouse. Then came the second death. 3 weeks later, Henrik Len, a retired logger from Norway, was found at the base of Devil's Bluff 40, feet below the ledge where he kept his wild beehives. He went up there regularly, even in his arthritic condition. Locals said he knew those rocks better than anyone. And once again, it was Timothy who found him. "I saw his hat in the bush," the boy told the search party. "I called out. No answer. So I went down to check. Henrik's neck was broken. Dr. Harding concluded it was an accidental fall. But he couldn't ignore the peculiar detail. Dozens of dead bees surrounded the old man's body, concentrated unnaturally in a tight cluster. When Harding climbed the bluff himself, the hives were undisturbed, calm, buzzing quietly in the warm breeze. Not a single sign of an angry swarm. When questioned, Timothy suggested maybe the bees stung Mr. Len and caused him to stumble. "He always said they get mad when you bother them," the boy added. It was plausible, perhaps, but not convincing. Doctor. Harding's journal that evening held a single line. "The boy is everywhere, and I don't believe in coincidences." The leaves had barely started to turn when death came for the third time. September arrived like a whisper, with golden skies and the sound of crickets stretching into the evening. The town was still mourning Mary Fletcher and Henrik Len, but no one dared to speak of the odd coincidence tying the deaths together. Not publicly. Not yet. 6-year-old Jacob Mills had a habit of vanishing into the woods near his family's cabin, often chasing frogs or pretending he was a soldier in some grand imaginary war. On a breezy Thursday afternoon, his mother called out for him as the sun dipped low, but Jacob didn't come back. A search party formed before nightfall, lanterns swinging between trees as fathers and farmhands pushed through brush, calling the boy's name until their throats were raw. Timothy Caldwell was among the first to volunteer. Adults tried to wave him off. He was just a child himself, but he insisted. "I know those woods better than anyone," he said with a voice far too sure of itself. "I can help." And he did. For 3 days, Timothy guided groups through dense groves and along forgotten animal trails. He moved like he belonged there, feet nimble, steps confident, hands brushing aside hanging vines like he'd walked those paths in dreams. The men followed him, impressed by his endurance and eerie sense of direction. Some began to wonder aloud how the boy had become so familiar with such remote terrain. Timothy said he liked gathering herbs for his aunt, that he explored in his free time, and no one questioned it too deeply. It was a practical answer, and practical answers were comforting in times like these. On the 4th morning, just before dawn painted the sky, Timothy arrived at the Mills cabin. His clothes were damp with dew, and his voice carried a heaviness it hadn't the day before. "I think I found something," he said. Standing in the doorway, Jacob's father was already awake, half crazed from grief and lack of sleep. He stared at the boy, desperate. Timothy didn't blink. "There's an old well," he said, "about half a mile north of here, hidden under logs and brush. I heard something maybe crying." The party moved fast, hearts pounding with hope. The well had long been forgotten, choked with weeds and half-collapsed timbers. They had to hack through branches to reach it. Someone lowered a lantern, and there, at the bottom, lay Jacob barely alive, curled like a leaf in the dark. They pulled him up. His face was blistered. From sun exposure, his lips cracked and his eyes dazed. But he was breathing. Dr. Harding arrived within the hour. He worked fast, using every remedy he had for dehydration and exposure. He tried to coax Jacob back, whispering the boy's name over and over, but it was too late. Jacob's body, young as it was, couldn't survive the damage. He died within the day. Harding didn't weep. He rarely did. But he stared at Timothy with new eyes after that. Something had shifted inside him. He had spent years studying the human body, its strengths, its limits, its responses to pain, and yet he felt outmatched in that moment by an 8-year-old boy who had led them to a dying child in an impossibly obscure location. The well was deep, too deep for sound to rise easily, too covered for even cries to escape. And yet Timothy had found it, claimed to have heard something. Harding went back the next day, alone. He knelt at the rim of the well and stared down into the shadows where Jacob had taken his final breaths. Around the mouth of the pit, branches had been arranged in a way that wasn't random. Logs were angled with purpose, placed to blend naturally into the undergrowth. The pattern was too careful, the concealment too perfect. It hadn't just been an accident. Somebody had hidden the boy there. And Harding was beginning to suspect who. When he looked up from the well, he saw nothing but trees. The silence pressed against his skin. His chest tightened with a strange realization. The killer was not some monster lurking in the dark. He was a child who wore politeness like a costume. That night, Harding began taking notes. Not scattered thoughts, but deliberate records, observations, patterns. A journal dedicated solely to Timothy Caldwell. Because, if he was right, if what he feared was true, then Sedalia County wasn't just cursed by tragedy. It was harboring something far worse, a predator wearing the face of a boy. Over the following weeks, Harding watched Timothy carefully. Not openly, just enough to track his habits, his expressions, the way he studied people. The boy sat in church with his family like a statue carved from cold porcelain. He recited hymns with a steady, lifeless tone. He helped his uncle mend fences and his aunt milk goats. He smiled when spoken to and always said the right thing. But underneath, Harding sensed a tension, like watching a coiled spring pretending to be still. He wasn't alone in his unease. Mrs. Patterson visited Harding one afternoon, her face drawn and eyes darting. She sat in his parlor, twisting her hands as she spoke. "I've lost 17 chickens," she whispered. 17 in 2 months, all of them dead in the morning. Necks snapped clean. She paused. "My husband says, foxes, but there ain't no prince. And they don't eat the bodies, just kill 'em and leave 'em." Harding frowned. "You've seen anything strange? Anyone near the coop?" She hesitated. "I've seen Timothy a few times, just walking along the fence line, like he's out for air." Harding nodded slowly. Later that week, he examined the most recent chicken corpse himself. The break in the neck was precise, not messy, not like a fox. The force had been applied at just the right spot, just the right angle, not random, not animal. Intentional. Then there were the calves. James Wickham, whose property bordered the Caldwell land, told Harding his young cattle had suffered strange accidents, choking on ropes, wedging their heads in fences, one after another. It made no sense. And always neighbors remembered one detail. Timothy had been nearby. He never trespassed. He never acted out. But he was always there. Harding's notes thickened. His writing became more urgent. He began testing Timothy in small ways, dropping false medical facts during conversations, watching to see if the boy corrected him. Timothy never did, but his eyes flickered, just slightly, as if filing the errors away. He was learning, absorbing. One day, Harding was tending to Sarah Caldwell's persistent cough. Timothy sat quietly nearby, eyes fixed on the doctor's hands. As Harding explained the basics of blood circulation, the boy interrupted with a question. "How do you know someone's really dead?" Timothy asked, his voice light. "Sometimes they just look like they're sleeping, right?" Harding stopped mid-sentence. He stared at the boy, who blinked innocently. "I mean," Timothy added, "what if you buried someone who wasn't actually gone?" The doctor nodded slowly, masking the chill climbing his spine. "That's why we check carefully," he replied. "There are signs," but he couldn't shake the question. The curiosity behind it. It wasn't the wondering of a frightened child. It was something else, something methodical. And so, as the autumn winds stirred dry leaves across the Caldwell farm, Dr. Harding's fear took root, because he no longer believed the boy was simply unlucky. He no longer thought the deaths were coincidence. He was beginning to believe that Timothy Caldwell was testing something, and the people of Sedalia County were his subjects. By October, the skies over Sedalia turned gray, heavy with the kind of stillness that makes even trees seem to listen. The cornfields had yellowed, the cattle moved slower, and neighbors spoke in softer tones, as if words might stir something. Watching from the edges of the woods, there was a hush in the land, but not peace. Not anymore. Dr. Samuel Harding had seen too much war to spook easily. Yet Timothy Caldwell lingered in his thoughts like a fever that wouldn't break. There was a strange calculation in the boy's gaze, like he was always 3 steps ahead in a game no one else realized they were playing. Harding's medical journals, once filled with lectures and case notes, now read like a detective's diary. He wasn't recording symptoms. He was gathering evidence, and that evidence was growing darker by the week. The deaths of Mary Fletcher, Henrik Lenn, and Jacob Mills had been declared tragic accidents. But Harding, by now, had moved past doubt. It wasn't just the pattern of misfortune. It was Timothy's eerie placement at the center of it all. And not just human deaths. Something was killing the animals, too. Livestock from the farms near the Caldwell homestead were dying in ways that didn't match any natural predator. Foxes don't break necks cleanly. Pigs don't cut themselves. Horses don't suddenly fall. Lame and require mercy killings. But it was happening. Over and over again. James Wickham's prized bull had broken its leg in a shallow ditch. Robert Dunham's calves had somehow strangled themselves in their own stalls. And again, always again, Timothy had been nearby, his presence explained away by chores, errands, or innocent curiosity. The pattern wasn't just repeating. It was escalating. Harding began visiting the Caldwell farm more frequently under the guise of checking on Thomas Caldwell's bad back and Sarah's chronic fatigue. But those visits weren't about medicine anymore. They were reconnaissance. Timothy was always there, always watching. On one visit, as Harding examined Sarah's lungs, he noticed Timothy standing silently near the doorway. The boy didn't fidget. He didn't look bored. He was studying. "You see the way her breathing sounds tight?" Harding said aloud, turning his head slightly to catch the boy's eye. "That's inflammation in the bronchial tubes." Timothy nodded. "Is that what causes the wheezing?" Harding blinked. "Yes, it blocks the airflow. Like pinching a pipe." Timothy tilted his head. "So if you squeezed the pipe harder, they couldn't breathe at all." It was said in a tone so casual, so devoid of menace, that it might have passed unnoticed by someone else. But Harding felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Yes," he replied slowly. "If it were squeezed completely shut, they'd suffocate." Timothy nodded again, storing the information like a coin in a lockbox. Later that week, Harding tested him again. "Did you know," he said over supper with the Caldwells, "that if someone's heart stops, you can bring them back just by slapping?" "They're just hard enough?" Thomas Caldwell laughed. Sarah looked puzzled, but Timothy just looked at him. One corner of the boy's mouth lifted slightly, almost like he was smiling at a joke no one else understood. He didn't believe the lie. Harding knew it instantly. The boy had started memorizing every medical truth the doctor offered and silently discarding the falsehoods, which meant he wasn't just interested. He was preparing. Harding's instincts, honed from treating men, blown open by cannon fire, whispered that this wasn't morbid curiosity. It was strategic, and so he began digging deeper. He returned to Willow Creek, where Mary Fletcher had died, retraced the bluff where Henrik had fallen, walked the woods near the old well. Each place felt too precise, too conveniently close to Timothy's. Known paths. These weren't accidents of geography. These were selections, controlled environments, like a scientist setting the conditions of an experiment. The final confirmation came on a freezing November morning. When Ella Lenina Patterson showed up at Harding's home, clutching a small burlap sack. "I brought you one," she said grimly. "Another one. Died last night." Inside the sack was a hen, its neck broken with such precision that even Harding winced. He examined it on the table, beneath his oil. Lamp, no feathers disturbed, no bite marks. Just a clean, sharp twist at the base of the skull. He didn't speak for a long time. Ella Lenina did. She spoke of shadows outside her window, of chickens, cowering at the edge of the co-op, of the cold feeling she got every time she saw Timothy's silhouette passing along the fence line. "It's like he walks without making sound," she whispered. "And the animals ... they know." Harding nodded, not because he believed in superstition, but because the facts didn't require any. The truth was bad enough. That evening, Harding returned to his journals and began outlining a timeline. 3 human deaths, escalating animal violence, disturbing behavioral patterns, and most alarming Timothy's growing fascination with death. But none of it was admissible. Not one piece of evidence would hold up in a courtroom. The boy hadn't been caught. There were no witnesses, only stories, only fear. Harding realized he needed more. The breakthrough came accidentally, during a conversation about war medicine. Harding was sharing a tale from his time in the field, how he'd once had to amputate a soldier's arm without chloroform. Most children would recoil. Some would ask why, or cry, or fall silent. Timothy didn't. Did he scream? The boy asked, calmly placing a piece of bread into his mouth. Yes. Harding replied cautiously. Timothy chewed and asked, "Was he awake the whole time? Or did he faint?" "Awake." "Did you like it?" The question stopped Harding cold. It wasn't said with malice. It was asked the way a boy might ask about the taste of a new fruit. Harding tried to answer, but found himself studying Timothy's expression instead. There was no cruelty there. No fear. Only ... interest. And that, more than anything, terrified him. The boy wasn't angry. He wasn't traumatized. He wasn't lashing out. He was curious. And in his curiosity, people were dying. Harding began arriving earlier for farm visits. He started watching Timothy when Timothy didn't know he was being watched. And that's when he heard the word cave. A place Timothy liked to visit. A place he went when he needed quiet. Harding asked Sarah about it over tea one afternoon. She waved the question off. Just some hollow behind the South Ridge. He goes there to think. I say let him. He's a strange child, but he's never caused trouble. But Harding felt a chill deep in his gut. He waited 2 days. Then, with a lantern in hand, he found the ridge and followed a narrow path through brush and low pine. At the end, behind a rock shaped like a kneeling man, he found it. The cave. And inside, he found the truth. Bones. dozens of them. Small ones, bird bones, rabbit bones. Some that looked too big to come from anything wild. There were tools, makeshift surgical knives, forged from rusted farm iron, sharpened with obsessive care. There were drawings, Timothy's drawings, not childish. Scribbles, but diagrams precise, shaded, labeled. Animal bodies opened, organs mapped, notes written in blocky but legible print. And in the corner, something worse, sketches of human figures. One, unmistakably, was Mary Fletcher. Another wore Henrik Lenn's beard. A third had the frail frame of Jacob Mills, collapsed inside a shaded well. The cave was a laboratory. The boy wasn't just present at these deaths. He had orchestrated them, he had documented them, and he had learned from them. Dr. Harding stood alone in that cold, silent cave and realized that he wasn't just witnessing the rise of a killer. He was standing inside the mind of one. The light from Dr. Harding's lantern flickered against the jagged stone walls, casting tall, twisted shadows that danced like spirits disturbed from slumber. His breath came shallow, not from the climb to the ridge, but from what he now knew. This place, this cave, hidden and quiet, was not just Timothy Caldwell's retreat. It was a sanctuary of methodical cruelty, a workshop of quiet horror built by a child. Dr. Harding crouched near the largest stone slab at the center of the cavern. It had been flattened, scrubbed clean, a surface for study or for sacrifice. Surrounding it were crude instruments, fashioned with eerie skill from sharpened nails, broken scissors, and pieces of plow iron. Every tool showed signs of use. Some had dried blood beneath the handles. Others were polished from frequent contact, the kind of wear that came only from repetition. But it was the drawings that truly froze the doctor's veins. Pinned to the walls with rusted nails and animal bones were page after page of illustrations. Not crude stick figures, but anatomically detailed renderings of creatures, birds, squirrels, rabbits, even a few larger farm animals, all in various stages of dissection. Timothy had taken notes beside many of them. Observations about breathing, bleeding, muscular response, time to death. Subject remained vocal for 6 minutes after chest puncture. Read 1. Screaming ceased only after airway was blocked. Heartbeat continued 47 seconds longer. There was no emotion in the handwriting, no remorse, just observation. But those weren't the worst pages. The ones that chilled Harding most were the human drawings. He found 3 prominent among the clutter. The first was clearly little Mary Fletcher. The pigtails, the short dress, the posture of her drowning body, it was unmistakable. Next to her were notes, not just about how she died, but how she struggled, the angle of her limbs, the bubbles from her mouth, the estimated time it took her to stop thrashing. The second was Henrik Lenn, drawn falling from Devil's Bluff, with annotations about the force of impact, estimated speed of fall, and the exact degree of rotation his body made mid-air. Even the scattering of bees had been documented in detail, how they were collected, stored, and released at the right moment to trigger panic. Then came the sketch of Jacob Mills. That one was the most haunting. It showed the boy curled at the bottom of the well, arms wrapped around himself. Timothy had written about the effects of dehydration, the way a child's body weakens slowly, the point at which hope vanishes from the eyes. Harding couldn't stay any longer. He backed out of the cave like a man escaping a tomb, the drawing seared into his mind. He didn't speak until he reached his buggy, and even then, his hands trembled too violently to hold the reins at first. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he opened his 3rd journal and began a new section titled Predator in the Guise of a Child. He recorded everything he had seen in the cave, every tool, every sketch, every word scribbled in that delicate, cold hand. And then he asked himself the question that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. What now? What do you do when the murderer is 8 years old? There were no legal avenues to pursue. No jury would believe that a child, even estranged, one had orchestrated 3 deaths and countless animal experiments. Harding didn't have photographs. He didn't have a confession. He had drawings. And the boy's drawings could be dismissed as dark fantasies, the outlet of a traumatized orphan. Nothing more. Worse, Harding knew what would happen if he went public. The community, already fragile from years of war and loss, would collapse under the weight of it. Neighbors would accuse one another. Rumors would spiral. Families would panic. So he did what he felt was the only rational thing. He continued watching. He scheduled more medical visits to the Caldwell home, always with a reason, always with the same routine, but his real focus was Timothy. He asked leading questions. He tested responses. He listened for cracks. And then one day, the boy gave him one. Timothy was sitting on the porch, sharpening a stick with a piece of flint when Harding approached. It was cold, and a thin sheet of frost glistened. On the ground. The boy looked up. I went to the cave, Harding said softly. Timothy paused, just for a breath. Then he smiled. It wasn't a child's smile. Not the kind that comes from joy or delight. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting to be found out. A chess player watching his opponent finally see the trap. You're not going to tell anyone. Timothy said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Calm. Absolute. Why wouldn't I? Harding asked. The boy shrugged. Because no one would believe you. And because you want to see what I'll do next. Harding didn't respond. Because the boy was right. He felt it in his bones, that knowing pull of curiosity. Not the kind born from voyeurism or fear, but from the part of himself that had once dissected battlefield corpses to understand how shrapnel tore through muscle. The part that needed to know how things broke physically, psychologically. Timothy saw that. He saw it plainly. How long have you been doing this? Harding asked. The boy didn't hesitate. Since I was 5. Maybe earlier. He continued sharpening the stick, methodical and unhurried. I started with bugs, then mice, then birds. It's interesting to see what's the same and what's different. Animals stop fighting fast. People don't. That makes it more informative. Harding kept his expression neutral. And the ones who died? He asked. They were experiments too, Timothy said, as if it were obvious. I wanted to know if people reacted the same way. They mostly do, but they know more. That changes things. Harding looked at him for a long time. Do you feel bad about what you did? Timothy blinked. No, he said plainly. But I understand that I should say I do. The wind stirred through the bare trees. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, then fell silent. You don't have empathy, Harding murmured. Timothy tilted his head. I know what that means. I've read about it. But no, I don't think I have that. I watch people. I can mimic what they do. But I don't feel it. Not really. There was no drama in his tone. No bitterness. It was like listening to someone. Describe the color of their eyes. And then he said something that made Harding's blood run cold. I want to see what happens when you hurt someone who trusts you. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Measured. Precise. Someone who wouldn't suspect. Timothy added, almost whispering, until it was too late. Harding didn't answer. He stood, nodded once, and walked away. That night, he began drafting a new plan. This wasn't a matter of theory anymore. It wasn't about observation or suspicion. It was about prevention, because now he knew. Timothy Caldwell wasn't content with experiments on animals, or with manipulating strangers. The boy had chosen his next subjects, and they lived under his roof. Dr. Harding sat at his desk long after the lamps had burned low, the scent of oil and paper thick in the room. His hand hovered over his journal, but for the first time in months, he didn't write. What he'd heard from Timothy that afternoon still echoed in his ears, quiet words delivered with terrifying calm. "I want to see what happens when you hurt someone who trusts you." He didn't say if. He said when. Harding stared at the spine of his medical text, the one he had carried across battlefields, where he'd seen men broken by lead and fire. But nothing in those pages prepared him for this, for the idea that evil could wear such a small face, that a child could think this way, plan this way. There was no more time to hesitate. The next morning, he rode into Sedalia to visit the one man he believed would listen without laughing him out of the room, Sheriff William Crawford, a veteran of the Union Army and a man known for action more than talk. Crawford had earned the town's respect by keeping order during the war's aftermath. When Harding entered the sheriff's office, he closed the door quietly and spoke without preamble. "I need you to hear everything I say, and I need you to believe me." To Crawford's credit, he didn't interrupt. He listened as Harding laid out the story, the deaths, the patterns, the animal mutilations, the cave, the drawings, and finally, Timothy's words. When Harding finished, there was a long silence. "You're asking me," Crawford said slowly, "to believe that an 8-year-old boy orchestrated 3 deaths and is planning to kill his own family." Harding didn't blink. "I'm not asking you to believe it blindly. I'm asking you to look at what I've seen. Drawings, journals, witnesses. That cave is real. What's in it is real." "And what's your plan?" Crawford asked. 2. Stop him before he moves on Sarah and Thomas." Crawford leaned back, fingers drumming against the edge of his desk. He sighed. "I've known Thomas Caldwell all my life. His wife, too. Good folks. I won't let anything happen to them." Then his gaze hardened. "But I also won't arrest a child based on theories and sketches. You know as well as I do, the court won't take it. We'll be the ones called mad." Harding nodded. "I'm not asking for an arrest. I'm asking for a watch. A trap, if you like." Crawford's brows lifted slightly. "Explain." Harding laid it out. A plan built around his next scheduled visit to the Caldwell farm. Thomas, who had recently injured his back harvesting corn, was already bedbound. Harding would bring medicine enough to sedate both Thomas and Sarah under the guise of pain relief and sleep assistance. Meanwhile, Crawford and 2 trusted deputies would position themselves around the property, hidden but ready. "He won't expect resistance," Harding said. "He believes he's already won." Crawford nodded, slowly but surely. "Then we'll show him he hasn't." The next morning, Harding arrived at the farm with a small leather satchel tucked beneath his coat. The sun hadn't fully risen, and a thick mist clung to the fields. The silence was unnatural. No rooster crowed. No dogs barked. No chickens pecked at the dirt. It was as if the farm itself was holding its breath. Timothy stood in the doorway before Harding reached the porch. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were waiting. "Good morning, Dr. Harding," he said, voice smooth as cream. "I've been expecting you." Harding felt the chill rise in his spine, but he kept his voice steady. "How are your aunt and uncle?" Timothy stepped aside, sleeping soundly. The doctor walked in. Inside the house, everything was still. Too still. Sarah and Thomas lay side by side in their bedroom, their faces calm, unmoving. Harding bent down and checked Thomas's pulse slow, but there. His skin was pale, and his lips tinged slightly blue. He'd been drugged. Not enough to kill, but enough to leave him defenseless. "What did you give them?" Harding asked. His back still turned. Timothy's voice came from the hallway. "Just herbs. There are so many useful plants in these woods." Harding didn't respond. They won't wake up for hours, Timothy continued. We've got plenty of time. Harding stepped back into the hallway and closed the door behind him. Timothy was already arranging things on the kitchen table ropes: a hammer, a length of cord, several blades, each item placed with calm precision. Don't worry, the boy said, not looking up. I'm not starting yet. I wanted to talk first. Harding kept a safe distance. About what? Timothy smiled. About how people react. You see, my other experiments, they were all on people who didn't know what was happening until it was too late. But you're different. You understand what I am. You're aware. That makes this more interesting. Harding's hand inched toward his satchel. Inside it, beneath a layer of bandages and tinctures, was a Navy Colt revolver. Timothy kept talking. I want to know what people like you do when they have to choose. Will you try to save them? He gestured toward the bedroom. Will you sacrifice yourself? Or will you run? Harding withdrew the pistol and pointed it at the boy. Step away from the table, he said evenly. Timothy stopped moving. His expression didn't change. That's a Navy Colt, isn't it? He asked. 6 rounds. How many people are you planning to protect today? Yourself, my aunt, my uncle. The 3 men waiting outside? Harding kept the gun level, but his hands felt slick. You want to understand what made me, Timothy continued. You want to know if I was born this way or made this way. You think if you learn enough, you can stop the next one. He was close now, closer than Harding liked. Step back. Instead, Timothy turned toward the bedroom. That was when Harding acted. He stepped forward, his voice booming. Don't take another step. But Timothy moved too fast. In an instant, he had a knife in his hand, drawn from his sleeve like a magician pulling silk from air. Harding blocked the first swipe, caught the boy's wrist, and twisted. The knife clattered to the floor. But Timothy pulled a second blade from his boot and slashed again, catching Harding's forearm. The pain was hot and sudden. From outside, boots thundered against the porch. The back door flew open. Sheriff Crawford and 2 deputies burst in, pistols drawn. Mitchell, the youngest deputy, tackled Timothy with such force that the boy's head slammed into the wooden floor. He didn't cry out, didn't struggle, just smiled. Bloodied, pinned, his hands tied behind his back. Timothy looked up at Harding. You still don't get it, he said. Crawford looked down at the child in disbelief. What kind of monster are you? Timothy grinned. His lips split, his eyes gleaming. I'm not a monster, he said. I'm just very, very curious. The Caldwell farmhouse sat eerily silent in the days following Timothy's capture. Sunlight passed through the windows like it didn't dare linger too long. The livestock stirred, but quieter now, as if they too sensed the shift. Thomas and Sarah Caldwell remained in bed for nearly 2 days, their bodies still recovering from whatever mixture the boy had slipped into their tea. Sheriff Crawford kept 2 deputies stationed at the house day and night, though Timothy himself had already been taken into custody. The boy had gone willingly. No shouting, no pleading, no tears. Just that same calm demeanor, as if being arrested was simply the next step in an experiment he'd long anticipated. At the sheriff's office, Timothy sat in a chair too big for him, legs dangling, hands bound only loosely behind his back. The ropes weren't necessary. He wasn't resisting. His pale blue eyes scanned the room like a surveyor, cataloging a new environment. The bruises on his face were fading, but his smile had not. You can't keep me here, he told Sheriff Crawford the next morning. Not really. The sheriff leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. We'll see, he muttered. Dr. Harding arrived soon after, arm bandaged, eyes heavy with sleeplessness. He hadn't come for justice. He'd come for truth, and maybe something deeper. Maybe closure. Maybe a last attempt to reach whatever part of Timothy might still be human. He stepped into the cell where the boy was held and pulled up a chair. "You've hurt a lot of people," Harding said softly. "I know," Timothy replied. "And you? We're going to kill your aunt and uncle." "I still might," Timothy said, not as a threat, but as a possibility. "One day, if I get the chance." Harding took a slow breath. "Why them?" Timothy shrugged. "They were close. That makes them valuable. It's different when the subject trusts you." He said it like a scientist discussing lab rats. Harding tried a different question. "Do you ever feel anything when someone dies?" Timothy considered the question for a moment. "Sometimes curiosity. Sometimes satisfaction. Never sadness." He tilted his head. "Should I?" The doctor didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked out, leaving behind a boy who didn't cry, didn't scream, and didn't beg. The problem was, the law didn't know what to do with someone like Timothy Caldwell. The year was 1867. The concept of child psychopathy didn't exist. There was no legal category for a murderous child who killed with forethought and precision. The sheriff's office couldn't hold him indefinitely, and no prison would. Take him. He was too young to hang, too dangerous to release. The county prosecutor reviewed the evidence, Harding's journals, the drawings from the cave, witness statements from neighbors, and the reports of Timothy's attack on his aunt and uncle. Most of it, the prosecutor declared, was inadmissible. There was no precedent for prosecuting a child for conspiracy, let alone murder. But the attempted killing of Thomas and Sarah, that was real. That was visible. That had witnesses. It was enough. Barely. After weeks of legal wrangling, a compromise was reached. Timothy Caldwell would not be sent to prison or executed. Instead, he would be remanded to the Missouri State Hospital for the insane in Fulton, where he could be studied, evaluated, and, in theory, treated. It was a solution that satisfied no one. The public wanted punishment. The medical community wanted to understand. The law wanted him gone. So they packed him into a guarded carriage and sent him east, accompanied by Dr. Harding, who had volunteered to oversee the boy's transfer and stay at least for a while. Timothy made no fuss on the journey. He stared out the window as if already memorizing routes, gauging distances, logging patterns. Fulton was a fortress of brick and barred windows, its halls filled with the echoes of minds undone by war, grief, and madness. Timothy did not scream upon arrival. He did not flinch when they assigned him a room. He thanked the staff when given food. He followed rules. He even smiled, and within a week, most of the attendants began to believe the boy had been misjudged. He cried during sessions. He spoke of regret. He asked forgiveness. Some staff said he was making remarkable progress. But Harding knew better. He stayed for 3 months, observing, quietly noting every false tear, every rehearsed apology. He watched Timothy mimic emotions the way an actor memorizes a part well enough to fool a crowd. But not the director. Timothy was studying everyone, not just the doctors, the patients, the guards, the routines. One nurse confided to Harding, "Sometimes when I'm in the hallway, I feel like he's already behind me, even if I just left his room." Another said, "He asked me what nightmares feel like, said he doesn't dream." But then came the coded journal, discovered by accident. Dr. Martha Fitzgerald, a visiting psychiatrist trained in European treatment methods, was given Timothy's written therapy exercises. They seemed innocent. Bailey. Thoughts, childish hopes, imagined remorse. But Fitzgerald had studied ciphers in college. A hobby once. She recognized something beneath the rhythm of the words. With patience and pattern matching, she cracked the code, and what she found stripped the last illusions from everyone in the hospital. The journal wasn't therapy. It was surveillance. each. Entry mapped behavior patterns of staff members when they arrived, when they were distracted, how they responded to various moods. Timothy had charted the hospital like a general preparing a siege. He noted which doors stayed unlocked, which keys dangled from which belts, which guards nodded off after lunch. Worse still were his new plans, more complex, more ambitious. He wrote of staged deaths, slow poisoning, of inducing hallucinations to drive patients mad, all theoretical, all testable, all chillingly plausible. Security tightened immediately. Timothy was moved to a different wing. Restrictions were placed on his interactions. His materials were taken, but it wasn't enough. Because on a hot morning in July 1868, Timothy Caldwell disappeared. Gone. Vanished during a routine transfer between wards, even while under supposed constant supervision. The official report blamed clerical error and staff miscommunication. Harding, upon hearing the news, said only one thing. He planned this a year ago. Within days, reports trickled in from towns across the Midwest: dead livestock, children missing, strange accidents. And always a child seen nearby, a polite, well-spoken child. Harding began to travel again, searching. He knew the signs now. What to look for, what patterns repeated. But Timothy was older now, stronger, smarter. And no longer a boy who needed to kill close to home. Dr. Harding had seen horror in many forms: open wounds, gasping lungs, battlefield screams, but none of it stayed with him the way the silence around Timothy Caldwell did. The boy was gone, and in his absence, a quieter dread took hold. Because what Harding feared most wasn't what Timothy had done. It was what he might do next. The news of Timothy's escape spread quickly, though officials at the Missouri State Hospital tried to contain the damage. They claimed he'd vanished during a hallway transfer, just slipped through a door left ajar, as if a child could simply disappear under the noses of armed guards and barred windows. Harding didn't believe a word of it. Disappeared wasn't the right term, not for Timothy. This wasn't a child fleeing punishment. It was something else entirely. This was a plan, a strategy executed with precision after months, maybe years of careful observation. He had studied the hospital as he had everything else. He hadn't escaped from it. He'd graduated. In the weeks that followed, Harding returned to his practice in Sedalia, but medicine no longer occupied his thoughts. Instead, he pored over newspapers, county records, livestock registries, any document that might hint at strange patterns. He looked for clusters, dead animals, missing children, quiet accidents no one could quite explain. The kind of tragedies that towns chalked up to bad luck and forgot. One such cluster surfaced just outside of Columbia, Missouri. A girl had gone missing. Her family said she vanished from the orchard behind their house. No sign of struggle. No footprints. A few days later, a neighbor's cat was found disemboweled in a barn. Then a horse broke its leg freak accident, they said. A week later, an elderly man wandered from his home and was found drowned in a rain barrel. Harding went there himself. He didn't ask for interviews or demand records. He simply walked the town's edges. And sure enough, on the third day, he found a boy, blonde hair, thin frame, helping load sacks of grain at a local mill. The boy called himself Eli, said he was staying with a distant cousin. No one could quite remember when he'd arrived. No one had thought to ask. The boy smiled when Harding passed. Polite, friendly, ordinary, but his eyes didn't. Smiled. Harding left without saying a word, because he knew it wouldn't help. Even if he had pointed and screamed, "That's him. That's Timothy Caldwell," no one would believe it. Not without proof. And Timothy, whatever name he was using now, was too careful for that. Back in Sedalia, Harding resumed his journaling with fresh urgency. He began building what he called his shadow map, a timeline of suspicious events across the Midwest, where Timothy might have been, what he might have done. Harding didn't always find bodies. Sometimes he found bones in strange places. Sometimes only patterns. Children developing night terrors. Animals going wild. Adults reporting odd little boys hanging around then vanishing. There was no way to confirm any of it. Harding felt it in his gut. Timothy was out there. Learning. Watching. Testing. In the fall of 1870, reports from Kansas surfaced unexplained livestock deaths on a family farm. A neighbor's child found with a broken neck beneath a hay bale. Harding rode west and interviewed the farm owner under the guise of treating an outbreak of illness. What he found was familiar. Clean neck breaks. No sign of predators. And one boy hired recently as a farmhand, he had arrived on foot, offered to help with chores, claimed to be the orphan son of a Civil War veteran. He had stayed 2 weeks. Then he vanished the night after the child died. The farm owner called the boy quiet, respectful, good with animals. Too good, Harding muttered. He continued west. By 1872, his journals had become something else entirely, not just records, but warnings. He no longer tried to prove what Timothy was. He had accepted it. Now he was trying to understand the scope. Was this what Timothy meant to become? A drifter who left no footprints, only victims? Or was there something larger in his mind? Some longer arc of violence that no one had yet imagined? The truth came. In fragments. In 1873, near Topeka, Kansas, a widow named Clara Jennings wrote to the Missouri Historical Society describing a blond boy who stayed in our barn and spoke too properly for a boy his age. Her husband was found dead days later, supposedly trampled by a cow in the middle of the night. The coroner called it an accident. Harding called it a signature. By 1875, Dr. Harding was receiving letters. Some came from doctors, others from townsfolk, who had read his anonymous pamphlet warning about precocious children with manipulative tendencies. The letters told stories of unsettling incidents, young boys with too much knowledge of anatomy, disappearances, drawings that seemed far too detailed for young hands. One letter stood out. It came from a nurse in St. Joseph, Missouri. She wrote of a young boy admitted to a local charity hospital. Blond, thin, polite. He had claimed to have no family, but had quickly become a favorite among the staff. He told vivid stories. He helped with minor chores. And then, one night, an old man in the next ward died. No one suspected foul play until they found sketches. Inside the boy's mattress were drawings of the man's face, one version sleeping, one with his mouth open in terror, one with his eyes half-lidded in death. The boy disappeared that same night. The nurse ended her letter with a single line: "I think your story is real, and I think you're not the only one watching." Harding began traveling again, older now, more tired, but more determined than ever. His work was no longer about saving one town. It was about understanding what Timothy had become, or worse, what he was evolving into. Because Timothy was no longer just a disturbed child. He was a system, a process, a traveling pathology, infecting the world around him. The final confirmation came in 1876, when Harding arrived in a rural Illinois village and visited a schoolhouse recently struck by tragedy. A fire had broken out in the teacher's quarters. The teacher, a young woman who lived alone, was killed. Students were relocated temporarily. The cause of the fire? Officially ruled faulty oil lamps, but Harding found something in the ashes. Charred notebook. Water damaged but salvageable. Inside, in shaky pencil, was a list of students. And next to one name, Thomas Gray, the teacher had written a note, extremely bright. Reads above level. oddly emotionless. Drew disturbing image of me dead. Said it was just practice. The name was false. Harding knew it instantly. It was him. Timothy had enrolled under a new identity. He had entered a schoolhouse, observed, practiced, and when it came time to disappear, he had done so in fire and silence. That night, Harding stared at his reflection in the hotel mirror. The lines in his face had deepened. His eyes, once clear and steady, now looked like they carried too much. He whispered aloud, to no one, "You're still watching, aren't you? You always were." And somewhere, perhaps in another state, maybe sitting quietly in a church pew, offering to help a farmer load his cart, Timothy Caldwell smiled. By the winter of 1877, Dr. Samuel Harding had abandoned the pretense of being a country physician. His home in Sedalia sat mostly empty, visited only when he needed to rest or write. Instead, he traveled by carriage, train, or horseback chasing. Shadows, following whispers. He was no longer trying to stop Timothy Caldwell. That had become impossible. Now he was trying to understand him. The boy, once 8 years old with pale blue eyes and a terrifying calm, had become a rumor carried. From state to state, Harding followed those rumors like a trail of smoke, recording every unexplained death, every child who vanished, every animal found with its throat too cleanly cut. He had grown older, thinner, and quieter. The weight of the work bent him in small ways. But not once did he turn away. Timothy had become a sickness in the back of the American mind, and Harding had decided long ago if he couldn't cure it, he could at least name it. He kept his journals meticulously, 22 leather-bound volumes, each filled with dates, places, victims, theories, and human reactions. They weren't just medical records anymore. They were a map of a particular kind of darkness. The kind that smiles when it kills. One question haunted him more than any other. Was Timothy alone? In the beginning, he had assumed yes, that the boy was a singular anomaly, some rare mix of intelligence and cruelty that had escaped nature's design. But as the years passed, Harding began to see something worse, something broader, a possibility that chilled him more than any drawing in that cave ever had. What if Timothy wasn't a mistake? What if he was a preview? The science of the time offered little help. Psychiatry was still in its infancy. Children, in the minds of most doctors and lawmakers, were thought incapable of evil. They could be misled, abused, traumatized, but not. Born bad. Harding knew better now. He had watched Timothy lie without blinking, kill without remorse, manipulate with terrifying skill. Not out of necessity, not out of pain, but out of desire, out of curiosity. That word again, curiosity, always at the heart of it. Timothy didn't hate his victims. He didn't even fear being caught. He simply wanted to know. What happened when you held someone underwater? What sounds they made when their bones broke? How long it took a person to understand they'd been betrayed? Harding had spent hours analyzing the boy's notes, decoding his journals, translating his actions into data. But beneath all of it was a mind built for control, like someone who didn't just study pain but admired its structure. In the spring of 1878, Harding received a letter from a physician in Iowa. The letter was vague but alarming. It described a boy who had been sent to a local orphanage after his parents died in a fire. Polite, intelligent, unusually quiet. The staff adored him. Until things started happening. Small things at first. A dog found dead. A piglet missing from the barn. Then a girl in the same dormitory who stopped speaking after being frightened in the night. She wouldn't say what she saw, only whispered, "He watched me sleep." Harding made the journey in less than 3 days. But the boy was gone. Discharged, the orphanage director explained. Sent to a more suitable family in a neighboring town. No name given. No record kept. Just like that, he had vanished again. By. Now, Harding had accepted the pattern. Timothy would insert himself quietly, offer help, mimic trust, and vanish the moment the environment grew suspicious. He moved like a storm that changed names every time it crossed a state line. And each time he reappeared, he was older, stronger, smarter. In 1880, a report from a Chicago physician brought new depth to the horror. The doctor had interviewed a young man, perhaps 16, maybe 17, found loitering near an abandoned slaughterhouse on the edge of the city. The man claimed to be a transient seeking work. But what disturbed the doctor were the boy's questions. How long does it take someone to blout from the throat? The boy had asked, do they stay conscious? The doctor had been so shaken that he wrote down the entire exchange and mailed it to Harding directly. Harding arrived in Chicago 3 days later. Too late. The slaughterhouse had burned to the ground. The night before he arrived. No injuries reported, no suspect named. But at the site, near the charred remains of a support beam, Harding found something half buried in ash. A sketch, drawn in charcoal. Scorched around the edges. It showed a man, sitting in a chair, his eyes open wide in surprise, his throat opened like a page in a medical text. The expression wasn't one of fear, but awe, as if he'd learned something terrible in the last moment before death. Harding didn't show the sketch to anyone. He simply folded it, placed it inside his coat, and left town before morning. By 1882, the stories reached as far west as Colorado. The frontier had a way of swallowing stories whole, but Harding heard them just the same: miners going missing in narrow shafts, children in mountain towns disappearing without trace, livestock poisoned with no known toxin. Each time, a boy or a young man was mentioned. Harding stopped asking for names. That he knew they were all the same person. The only real name Timothy had ever needed was the one that no one believed. He spent the next year consolidating his notes, writing what he hoped would become the most complete psychological record of a developing sociopath ever compiled. He no longer believed Timothy would be caught, no longer hoped to see him locked away, but he could leave behind a trail, a record. So that when it happened again, when another child showed the same signs, asked the same questions, someone might be ready. And then came the letter, dated December 6th, 1883. No return address. Just a small envelope, the handwriting neat, deliberate. Inside, one page. Dear Dr. Harding, you once asked how I became this way, whether the first was made or born. I've wondered that myself, but lately I've come to believe it doesn't matter. You wanted to understand me, so I offer you this instead. There are others. They don't all look like me. Some are younger, some are girls, some laugh more. But they're like me inside. They're watching, waiting. You taught me something I hadn't fully understood until now. How to study people not just as subjects, but as systems. Thank you. Harding read the letter 5 times. He didn't eat that day, didn't sleep that night. Because whether it was real or not didn't matter. The idea had already taken root. What if Timothy Caldwell wasn't the only one? What if he was only the beginning? By the time the calendar turned to 1884, Dr. Samuel Harding no longer felt like he was chasing one boy. He was tracing a pattern that had begun with Timothy Caldwell, but no longer ended with him. Something had shifted. It was subtle at first, a creeping discomfort in Harding's mind, like the slow ache of a tooth gone bad. But it grew more present with every letter, every whisper of an incident in some small town no one cared about until someone died. The places changed: Iowa, Nebraska, even up into Minnesota, but the storylines felt rehearsed. A new boy in town, polite, curious. Then something strange. Then something worse. One account from a pastor in South Dakota described a child who asked whether hell would feel different for people who didn't believe in fear. When the pastor questioned the boy's meaning, the child smiled and said, "I just want to know what breaks a soul." The pastor died 3 days later from a venomous bite. His cabin had been filled with copperheads, released from a wooden box nailed shut with intricate care. No one could explain how they got there. But the congregation remembered the boy blonde hair, pale eyes, always quiet. He had vanished the same night. Harding knew it in his bones. It was Timothy. Or someone like him. The line between those two. Possibilities had begun to blur. At times, Harding wondered if Timothy had grown older. Other times, he considered a darker possibility, that Timothy was creating something training others, even if they didn't know it, that his methods were spreading like seeds on the wind, taking root in dark corners. After all, wasn't that how evil really worked? Not as a monster under the bed, but as a whisper passed from one curious child to another. The idea disturbed Harding more than any body he had seen, more than the cave, more than the well. Because an idea couldn't be killed or locked away, it didn't grow tired. It didn't die. It multiplied. He began to revisit the earliest records, his own notes from those first tragic months in Missouri, the cave, the drawings. He looked at them not as isolated incidents, but as blueprints. Every step Timothy took had been measured, controlled. But what if those drawings weren't just records? What if they were instructions? That spring, Harding traveled to a small river town in Wisconsin after receiving a letter from a schoolteacher. The letter, barely legible and clearly written in haste, described one of her pupils, a girl no older than 10. Quiet, intelligent. She had a fascination with anatomy, had once brought a dead bird to class, and calmly opened its chest to show the other children its heartbeat machine. When the teacher confronted her, the girl replied, "It wasn't hurting anymore. I made sure." 2 weeks later, a boy from the same school was found drowned in a shallow stream. No wounds, no bruises, no reason, just gone. Harding arrived too late. The girl had already been taken from school by her parents, who denied anything unusual. She was just different, they said. She liked books. She liked quiet. She didn't mean any harm. Harding knew that tone. The need for denial. The hope that ignoring the signs might make them disappear. But they never did as he rode out of town. A strange question circled in his mind like a vulture. Had Timothy written to her too? Was the letter he received thanking him, informing him of others, truly meant for him alone? Or had there been many letters? Had Timothy found a way to spread his legacy without lifting a blade? In July of that year, Harding took up brief residence in Omaha. He rented a small attic room over a tailor shop and kept mostly to himself. But from that desk, beneath the slanted ceiling, he wrote what he feared would become his life's most important work, a manuscript titled The Pattern of the Quiet Ones. It wasn't meant for publication. It wasn't a memoir. It was a guide, a warning, a collection of cases, signs, behavioral markers, all gleaned from the trail Timothy had left across a decade. Harding filled page after page, notes about empathy mimicking, signs of staged remorse, the way certain children learned adult language far too early, the frequency of animal dissection as peak-way behavior, the obsession not with pain but with reaction. They don't hate, he wrote, they observe. And their observation is pure, cold, unclouded by conscience. It makes them effective. It makes them patient. The manuscript grew. He added maps, names, descriptions of dreams he'd had of cold hands and calm voices, of being asked questions he couldn't answer without bleeding. Sometimes he imagined Timothy watching him write, not with rage, but with amusement, pride even, because in some dark way, Harding was doing exactly what Timothy had always done. Studying By the end of 1885, Harding received a parcel wrapped in rough cloth and tied with twine. No return address. Inside was a journal. A child's handwriting. Unmistakably real. The first entry read, "My name doesn't matter. I only write because he told me to." Harding turned the pages carefully. They were filled with diagrams, thoughts, musings on death, questions about poisons, sketches of traps. It was like reading an echo of Timothy's original work, but cruder, less elegant. Still, the structure was there. The logic. The control. Toward the back was a passage that made Harding's throat tighten. I met him once. He asked if I ever felt the quiet before something breaks. He told me that's where I should live. In that moment, I think I do. Harding closed the journal slowly. He didn't know who had sent it, or where the child had come from. But he understood the message perfectly. Timothy had become more than a person. He had become a doctrine, and doctrines travel. They pass through eyes, through questions, through the space between a thought and an action. Harding revised the final chapter of Vav, the pattern of the quiet ones that night. He wrote, "If you are reading this, know that the face of what you fear will not always look cruel. Sometimes it will. Smile. Sometimes it will help you carry firewood. Sometimes it will ask you about the weather. And sometimes it will look exactly like the child you love. But inside, beneath the bone, it will be watching, always watching, for the moment you let your guard down." He signed it, closed the book, and locked it in a chest beneath the floorboards of the tailor's attic, because Harding had come to understand something most never would. Timothy didn't need to kill anymore. Not personally. Others would do it for him. By 1886, Dr. Samuel Harding was no longer a physician in the traditional sense. He hadn't treated a patient in years, hadn't written a prescription, hadn't stitched a wound. What he did now couldn't be called medicine, not by any school. Or board. He studied people, yes, but not to heal them. He studied them to predict the harm they could cause. His name, once associated with battlefield healing and early psychiatric reform, now circulated in quiet circles among coroners, asylum attendants, rural constables. They passed his name like a secret. Some called him paranoid. Others called him obsessed. A few whispered he had lost his mind, chasing the ghost of a boy who, for all anyone knew, had died long ago. But Harding knew better. Timothy Caldwell hadn't died. He had simply multiplied. The old doctor had started hearing a phrase repeated across his travels, never written, never reported in formal papers, but always whispered when someone finally let their guard down. The boy had dead eyes. It surfaced again and again. Different regions, different accents, but always the same description. There was a kind of lifelessness in these children, not from trauma, but from stillness. A calm that unsettled. Teachers, priests, nurses, all of them described the feeling of speaking to someone who was there. And not. Harding began collecting those accounts, like a priest gathering confessions. In November of that year, he was summoned to a county asylum near Hannibal, Missouri, by a colleague who had read the pattern of the quiet ones in secret. The doctor didn't believe everything in the manuscript, but he believed enough. There was a girl there, the man said, 15, locked in solitary after a string of incidents too strange to categorize. She'd been orphaned at 6, moved through 6 homes in 9 years. Each time, she stayed no longer than 18 months. Each time, someone died, never directly tied to her, never charged, but always suspicious. A fall downstairs, a stove explosion, a drowning in a locked bathhouse. And now she sat, day after day, drawing in the same notebook. Always the same image. A man with hollow eyes and a stitched mouth. When Harding arrived, she refused to speak for the first hour. Then she broke the silence with a single question. Do you know the boy who watched the sparrow die without blinking? Harding froze. I do, he replied quietly. Her lips curled into the faintest smile. Then you already know. I'm not the first. She didn't give a name, didn't say she had met Timothy. But Harding no longer needed direct confirmations. The pattern spoke for itself. There was a theology forming. One passed not by books, but by influence. Timothy's presence could be traced not by blood, but by logic. A new breed of cruelty had begun to surface, refined, intelligent, curious. That word again, always that word. In early 1887, Harding found himself at a small school for boys outside. Topeka, a teacher there, had written to him, shaking as she described the incidents that led to her resignation. She believed in education. She believed in reform. But something had changed in her last class. There's one boy, she wrote, who only watches. He answers questions when called, but never more. The other boys mimic his behavior. When he started pulling wings from insects during recess, 3 others began doing the same. Harding arrived too late again. The boy had left the school. Vanished. No record of guardianship. No forwarding address. He could feel the pattern accelerating. What had once been a trail marked by violence and disappearance had now become something more difficult to see. Timothy was no longer just moving. He was spreading. Harding returned to Sedalia in the spring. Older now, bones brittle, lungs dry from too many winters on horseback. But he brought with him something he hadn't possessed in years. Resolve. He would publish. Not just the manuscript, but everything. His journals, his sketches, the ciphered letters, the decoded transcripts from the asylum, the drawings found in attics, the names of every child he had ever suspected. He knew what people would say, that he was mad, that he was fabricating. But he didn't care. The world had a right to know what was coming. He rented space in a St. Louis print house, paid the man extra to keep the typesetter silent. For 2 weeks, he worked through the night, editing line by line, watching ink bleed onto the page like veins on parchment. By the end of May, the first 200 copies were bound and boxed. He titled the book plainly, The Doctrine of Shadows, a Study in Emerging Sociopathy. He sent copies to universities, asylum directors, major newspapers, and 5 members of Congress. He waited. 2 weeks passed. 3. And then the silence shattered. A single letter arrived, unmarked. Inside was a page torn. From the Doctrine of Shadows. His own words. Annotated in red ink. Next to a paragraph where he described the early signs of sociopathy: animal torture, charm without empathy, and calculated deception. Someone had written, "You understand us better than we thought you would." On the back of the page, a final note. "We're listening, Dr. Harding. Are you?" He folded the letter with trembling fingers and placed it in the same chest where the first sketch from the cave still lay, now yellowed with time. That night, he sat in his old chair beneath the window. Outside, children played in the streets. A dog barked. A mother called her son in for supper. The world kept turning. But he knew, somewhere, in one of those homes, was another child watching. Not playing, not smiling, just watching, noticing the cracks in how people worked, and waiting for the moment to see what broke first. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't sleep many nights after that. Because Harding had realized something far worse than Timothy's existence. He had realized that Timothy might not want to be alone, and the world was full of children who were waiting to feel something. Anything. Or nothing at all. In the winter of 1888, snow fell thick over Sedalia. It blanketed rooftops and buried fences, turning the town into something hushed and dreamlike. The streets slowed. Footsteps disappeared moments after they were made. Chimneys breathed smoke. Into an indifferent sky. Dr. Samuel Harding, now nearing 70, watched it all from his study window. He hadn't left the house in days. His body had grown frail, his hands unsteady, his hearing dulled. But his mind remained painfully sharp, sharp enough to remember every name, every death, every sketch, sharp enough to know that no matter how far the snow reached, it could never cover what had been unleashed. The letters had stopped coming. No more red annotations. No more warnings tucked in packages. But Harding understood. The silence wasn't peace. It was permission. Somewhere out there, Timothy was no longer hiding. He had succeeded in something far more dangerous than evasion. He had taught the world how to forget him while making copies of himself in minds. Too young to understand what they were becoming. In the corner of Harding's study sat the old chest, his archive of the unspeakable, the cave sketches, the journal found in Illinois, the ciphered notebook from the asylum girl. Every piece of it carefully preserved in wax paper, sealed away from air, but not from memory. He had once dreamed that someday a university might take these artifacts, study them, and finally understand the depth of the sickness he had spent half his life chasing. Now he wasn't so sure. He had seen what institutions did with uncomfortable truths. They buried them. Harding lit a fire in the hearth and pulled his final journal from the drawer. The leather cover was worn, edges soft from handling. He opened it to a blank page and stared at it for a long time before writing, January 2nd, 1888. If anyone finds this, if the world has not yet closed its eyes, entirely know this much. Evil does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes in a whisper, in a child's question, in the absence of empathy behind a smile. I have watched it grow like ivy across the American mind. I have traced its seeds to the smallest corners. And still, it spreads. He paused. Then. Continued. Timothy Caldwell is no longer a name. He is a method, a possibility, a blueprint for how a child can learn not love or remorse, but precision and silence. And when the world refuses to name that, it invites its return. Again and again. He signed the page, folded the journal shut. And placed it in the chest with the others. Later that month, Harding's housekeeper found him in his chair, eyes closed, hands folded in his lap, peaceful, unmoved by the cold draft sneaking through the window pane. The coroner said he died quietly, perhaps in his sleep. There were no signs of struggle, no final note, just a room lined with books, and the soft scent of burnt cedar lingering in the fireplace. The town buried him without ceremony. Just another old doctor, faded from memory. His belongings were boxed. His furniture sold. And the chest? Discovered by a second-hand dealer who thought it might fetch a good price, given its antique hinges and sturdy construction. He didn't open it right away. When he finally did, weeks later, he found sketches and notes too strange to make sense of. He burned most of it out of fear, sold a few drawings to a collector of the macabre. The rest scattered like ash across time, misfiled, misunderstood, or simply lost. And with them, the trail faded, but not entirely. In 1890, 2 years after Harding's death, a report surfaced in Central Texas. A boy found alone, wandering a dry riverbed. He had no name, or claimed not to. He was placed in the care of a local church-run orphanage. The sisters noted his intelligence, remarked on his polite behavior. But they also mentioned how the animals stopped coming near the property, how the other children began waking with night terrors, how one of them, a boy named Eli, was found motionless near the well. No clear sign of trauma. The local doctor blamed heart failure. The sisters closed the orphanage within the year. The boy was never accounted for. In 1895, a woman in Kansas City published a private memoir detailing the murder of her brother, which had occurred in 1865. She described a boy present at the time, a quiet blonde child who had asked unsettling questions about her family's habits. When asked for a name, she hesitated, then wrote something that made little sense at first glance. He called himself Timothy, but the name didn't fit. It was like he borrowed it just to see how it felt. The book sold fewer than 500 copies. It was dismissed as sensational fiction. Most never read the final chapter, in which she wrote, "Sometimes I dream of him still, standing at the edge of the woods, watching the house. He doesn't age. He doesn't leave. I think he's waiting for something. I think he's waiting for someone like me." Years passed. The world changed, but certain names never vanished. Every few decades, a new set of reports would surface. A town would whisper of a child too calm, too charming. A pet would be found gutted. A neighbor would die unexpectedly. Sometimes it was a boy, sometimes a girl, but always the same stillness in their eyes, as if they were reading a script written long before they were born. Modern science would eventually give it labels: antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, conduct disorder. But Harding's words still ring truer. They do not hate. They do not love. They only notice and wait. In the early 20th century, fragments of Harding's journals were rediscovered by a young psychiatrist studying at the University of Chicago. He read the pages with a mixture of skepticism and awe, but he couldn't shake one passage, underlined in pencil, nearly faded with time. You won't hear him coming. You won't see him watching. He'll already be there, in the seat beside. Your child. In the mind of someone waiting to understand what it feels like when something stops breathing. The psychiatrist filed the notes away. He never spoke of them publicly. But decades later, when lecturing on child psychology, he often began with a question: "What do you think evil looks like at 8 years old?" And the classroom would go quiet, because no one ever quite knew how to answer.